Well, it's fantastic to welcome you all to this event. Impact, research impact, it's something that we're all really keen on investigating, on understanding. And of course, the reason for our research, one of the main reasons, is that we have an impact that we change lives. It's brilliant to be partnering with Emerald, so BERA working together with Emerald on this event. It's something that, partnerships in general are something that BERA welcomes. And of course, at the heart of all our partnerships is research impact. And so it's, as I say, fantastic to be doing that today. I'm not going to say very much because I'm excited about all the speakers we've got today. I will say one thing about BERA's interest in what we call close to practice research, one of the many angles on research that BERA has, and then I'll just say something a little bit about the speakers. So BERA was founded nearly 50 years ago, partly on the idea of the way that education research intersects with some of the practices to do with education, not least, for example, teacher education and training. And at the birth of BERA were debates about how do we ensure that we have the very best practice, but how do we also ensure that education is a lively and strong academic discipline. And so over the 50 years, those things have played out. Most recently, we've done some work, or BERA's done some work, and I have personally been involved with it as it happens, to do with what we're calling close to practice research. And this is research where impact, of course, is kind of built in from the beginning, because people who have great expertise mainly in practice and people who have great expertise mainly in research come together and they're looking in the same direction. They want the research to be robust, but they want it also to have impact on children's lives, other learners' lives, society, and on society. So let me introduce our three amazing speakers today. They will be presenting for us. We're looking forward also to hearing shortly from Sharon from Emerald as well. But first of all, Natalia Kuchakova. She's a professor of early childhood education and development at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and also professor of reading and children's development at the Open University. And I'm delighted to say she's also a visiting professor at University College London, where I am. And I know Natalia well. Natalia's work is concerned with social justice in children's literacy and use of technologies. She's the founder of the International Collective of Research and Design in Children's Digital Books that connects practitioners, researchers, and designers interested in children's digital reading. And she was the winner of the Emerald Impact Global Award in 2019 for developing a focus on life cycle approaches to impact. Helen Beddoe is the Impact Services Lead for Emerald Publishing, I should say in full. She joined Emerald as a publisher in 2017, moving into the wonderful world of social sciences after completing her PhD on Antarctic climate change 25 million years ago. I'm sure she wasn't working 25 million years ago, but a very important topic. And so this is about the climate cycle, she says, not the PhD. And she did it at Utrecht University. Since 2019, Helen's been working in collaboration with impact professionals on developing toolkits that support researchers to understand and plan for research impact. Our third speaker, Tom Crick, is Professor of Digital Education and Policy at Swansea University. His academic interests are naturally interdisciplinary and sit at the research policy practice interface. Tom chaired the Welsh Government's review of the ICT curriculum in 2013, and more recently led the development of the science and technology area of learning and experience in the new curriculum for Wales, published in January 2020. He was appointed MBE in the 2017 Queen's Birthday Honours and received the 2020 BERA Public Engagement and Impact Award for his wider curriculum and education policy work in Wales. Welcome everyone, and I'm now handing over to Sharon.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Sharon Parkinson. I'm a Publishing Development Manager at Emerald. And obviously you just saw the Emerald video there, which I'm sure woke you up on a Monday morning, possibly made you want to go clubbing, but that might be the closest that we get to it for the time being. I'm really pleased that we've been able to partner with BERA to deliver this session today. The impact agenda, as Dom has said, is very much a priority for the research community, certainly here in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, and it's also gaining momentum across the world. The Research Excellence Framework here in the UK, and perhaps more loosely, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, remain committed to impact, and of course so do the many funders that require applicants to consider the impact of their work for success, which of course can be very challenging, and I guess that's probably one of the reasons why you joined the session today. There's a lot of variation around the world in terms of what researchers are required to do by their institution, so at that institutional level. But despite this, there is a real drive underpinning everything to have research that produces change and contributes to solving world problems, which is of course researcher-led. So for us as a publisher, our stance really centres around publishing research that has this focused attention on positive change as a result of well-planned collaborative research, and that enables those outputs to become the foundation. And of course we often publish those outcomes, but they become the foundation for some really tangible outcomes and some compelling stories, and you will be hearing a couple of compelling stories this morning. We have a mission, we actually have a manifesto to support that mission, and that is to lead the publishing charge towards meaningful impact. So we work with our global author network to publish research which makes a difference. And we also invest further in the research community to support real world change. And I guess this session is one example of that. So finally, yeah, I hope you enjoy the session this morning. I hope you find it informative and inspiring. I would encourage you to make use of the question opportunities throughout the session. But certainly please get in touch with me or Emerald generally after the event at any point if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on, any questions you have. And we would especially love to hear from you if you have any impact stories yourself or experiences. We also have some impact resources to help support institutions and researchers. So get in touch with me after the event if you're interested in learning more about those. So thank you. Thanks, Dom.
Brilliant, thanks. And so without further ado, let's hand over to Natalia for our first talk.
Thank you, and hello everyone. My name is Natalia Kuchirkova, and I am delighted to be sharing some thoughts on what impact is, why I believe it is important, and then give you some examples for how it can be applied in practice. So first of all, what is impact? And you know, Helen will be probably giving you more specific vocabulary on how we can define impact. And there is also a very good definition on the ESRC website, which you can access by scanning this QR code. But really, impact is associated with so many different keywords and tag words, some of which are listed in this word cloud, that it's useful to reflect on what we actually mean by it before we embark on it. So I like to think about impact as either transactional or transformational. And I suppose the transactional kind of impact is more like a two-way traffic. But the transformational type of impact is the sort of work that transcends your work beyond a specific place, beyond a specific time. It's the sort of work that is embedded in relationships with the people that you work with. And those are the people who can then carry the work further. So I want to talk about the transformational impact. Why? Well, there was this lovely poll at the beginning, and I was delighted to see that many of you selected the option that you believe research impact is important because it goes beyond academia. And that has to do with moral, ethical reasons. It can also be transformational because you want to make sure that you're part of the wider conversation in the society. And you also need to fulfill the funders' expectations. So here are some key reasons for impactful research. And I would say that out of these 7 bullet points, I'm most excited by the last one. So to generate work that is used and valued by the society. Now I'm going to give you some examples, but really impactful research is about making sure that you contextualize the specific niche area where you work within your own area of research. So take my examples just as illustrative examples. I was thinking when I was embarking on my work about who are the people, who are the key stakeholders I want to influence with my work. I'm interested in children's use of technologies, specifically digital books. So I was thinking, well, the key stakeholders are children's parents, teachers, librarians, designers, publishers. These are the gatekeepers, so to speak. Then you need to think about the unique selling point or the unique value of your work. Where does it fit best within the wider landscape? So in my case, within the wider landscape of children's technology use. And then the values and relationships. They are so, so important when it comes to impactful research. Here is an example of how we collaborated with teachers. We developed the Digital Book Award or set it up. It is a collaboration with the United Kingdom Literacy Association, as well as Book Trust, the literacy charity. And it is the only award that is judged entirely by teachers. So teachers choose the best ebooks for young children. We also co-developed a website for parents where they can select ebooks and literacy apps based on criteria that are embedded and rooted in research. I strongly believe that if you want to understand a phenomenon, you have to be part of making it. So I was lucky enough to co-develop some products for young children, where I could see what sort of difficulties designers and app developers have when they develop ebooks for young children. So here are some examples. We also need to think about the broader landscape. So when I had the opportunity to co-design this massive open online course with colleagues at the Open University, it was a huge opportunity to scale up the research and make sure that it becomes part of a global and really massive conversation. And all of this work needs to be not only documented by research articles, but also guided by some strong theoretical frameworks. So here is an example of how researchers, designers, and practitioners need to come together to develop a product for young children. Whatever you do, it is important to disseminate it, and you will be familiar with some traditional ways of disseminating research. There are also some exciting new ways of disseminating your work. I'm sure Tom will mention some of the social media type of dissemination that is available these days, blogging, but also having your research printed on a teacup. There are new ways of how you can make sure that the work you do is being communicated in an exciting way to the wider audience. And there are some books to guide you on this journey. I co-edited a book with Oliver Quinlan, the digitally agile researcher, that is full of different tips and ideas for those of you who want to perhaps explore more of these new exciting ways of dissemination. Now I'm giving this talk at times of major distress. So I just want to make sure that we all recognize the importance of small and quiet voices in this landscape, and remember that research impact is about collaboration and collective work. And yeah, this quote nicely captures my thinking about impactful research. Thank you for listening. And I suppose now it's time for questions.
Hi, I'm sorry, oh, here we are. Just a little bit of a delay on my video restarting. Natalia, thanks so much. I'm not going to talk a lot between talks. I would encourage, I'm sure, well, you've certainly made me think, and I can see that already there are some questions popping in, but just wanted to say straight away that I thought the focus on developing products, if you like, perhaps with children, was really interesting. And you know, this is a personal interest of mine, as you know, and that, you know, that kind of engagement, and it's something we think about a lot, isn't it? That, you know, how can we engage with young children when naturally they're at a certain stage of development and so on. So I thought that that's one thing personal to me that really stuck in my mind. Anyway, I better turn to the questions. We'll have maybe one, maybe two, I don't know, between each speaker. Now, I've got a question here from Marco Antonio Fuente. Impact, in quotation marks, seems to develop from a positivistic perspective, measurable, immediate cause effect. Is this the end of critical research, history, philosophy, issues that the mainstream would not like to hear, let alone to apply? Disseminating is doing marketing. Oh, that's a provocative start. Natalia, do you want to say something about that?
I love that question, and thank you so much for phrasing it this way. I think we made a huge mistake by approaching impact with some big lofty statements, you know, that you can change the world or impact all children's lives. Impact that comes from research needs to be very, very specific, because research is specific. And if we adjust the metrics to what we can actually achieve in terms of impact, then I guess the what's the expression, that the dog is wagging the tail is wagging the dog, or something like that, you know, so that the target is not what we are aiming to achieve in terms of making some kind of metric being the key target that we aim for in schools and universities, but that we make it a meaningful metric. And that sort of impact measurement is then about local values. It is about what comes from the ground, from the people we work with. So in my case, the different stakeholders I mentioned. So yeah, that, I suppose that's a bit of a muddled answer.
It's a profound question, and of course, when the word philosophy is mentioned, we need a bit of time. So maybe we'll come back to some of these things. I'm going to do one more question for now. I'm going to try this one. Actually, there was one it's not in view at the moment, but I'll find it. Here we are. Right. So Helen Ross. I'm just paraphrase slightly. Was asking about how do you know, for example, that there's been impact? Say, if you take the Teachers in the Book Awards, how do you know that the research has an impact? And I do think that's a really interesting question, in the sense that on the one hand, books have a profound influence on society. And I don't just mean academic books, actually. I'm talking about the whole world of books. But we have these social science definitions, mainly actually generated in the UK by the REF, don't we? Around a very particular, robust sort of sense of impact. Anyway, the question is, how do we know what the impact is if we're thinking about things like Teachers in the Book Awards?
Yeah, again, an excellent question, and I can only answer from my perspective. I would say that it's about this sustained engagement. That is how you can, I don't really know whether you know that there was an impact, but you can see some signs of it, and then you can interpret it as impact. So what we have seen was that teachers who have participated in the Digital Book Award for several years have developed their own understanding of what is high quality in children's ebooks. And then they made more discerned choices about the selection of the material that they were presenting to children. And that then influenced the design, because designers want to make sure that teachers like what they design. And then it travels to the child and to what they inform parents about. So I suppose it needs to be about this travel of influence and embedded in the whole system.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for the questions. Already that sparked really interesting issues. I'm going to pass now to our second speaker. So, Natalia, thank you for now, and over to Helen next.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. Oh, it says the host has stopped my video and I'll start it again. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Helen Beddoe, and hopefully you can all hear me and see me. I'm the Impact Services lead at Emerald Publishing. So, at Emerald Publishing, I think first of all, it's really important to define what we're talking about by impact. There are many different definitions that kind of have subtly different focus. So what we mean by impact is the measurable change, the benefit of research in the real world. So these kind of demonstrable, measurable changes that you can capture that happen beyond the academy as a result of a particular piece of research. And where all of the different definitions kind of coalesces around this idea of measurable change in the real world. Essentially, impact is measured where its effects are felt. So it's the changes that we can see, capture, really get hold of, and it's the kind of directional language that you use when you're talking about impact. So, impact is an increase, it's a decrease, it's something made safer, it's something made cheaper, it's something made faster, it's something decreased. This kind of directional language really indicates the demonstrable nature of impact when we're talking about it. I think it's also important actually to go back to the question that was asked to Natalia around academic impact. Academic impact, critical research that affects the understanding of the scientific method, of how we do research, that applications that say cross within disciplines, that's still very valuable. And thinking about impact, thinking about that critical research and the academic impact of that can still have societal impact. If that academic impact has an effect on another piece of research that then goes on to create impact, that academic impact is still part of that chain that leads to societal impact. If you think of impact as dominoes, they're all necessary within that chain of dominoes to get to the end result. So a piece of your research that you've conducted that affects another piece of research that goes on to create impact is still part of that change. And in tracing impact pathways, it's important to keep that in consideration. I think also when we're talking about impact, it doesn't have to be enormous. It doesn't have to be linear. And in fact, it's frequently not. It doesn't have to happen at the end of your research project. It can happen at any stage. Even if you think about at the very start, if you're involving different stakeholders and practitioners within your research, you're still making an impact on that group. So bearing in mind that impact can happen at any stage of the research project, and that change change really happens in this kind of stepwise, incremental effect. You know, there are pieces of research that create, you know, big change, national change, but a lot of the time, change is made up of small pieces. So finding where your research sits within that change is one way to one way to talk about the impact of your research. So could you go to the next slide, please? So when we're thinking about impact, impact is really in the eye of the beholder. Researchers aren't the ones who actually implement the change in practice. And additionally, researchers aren't necessarily the people who decide what the impact is or its value to the group. So, you know, it's about getting your research over that wall from out of academia into where the effects are felt, where the benefits happen and where they're implemented. I think thinking about what change you want your research to make, you know, who is that group for? What does that group need? And how do you know that's what they need? How do you know that that's the same as what you think they need? You know, if you think about it, one example I always use is, you know, kind of there was some research around wheelchair design, which produced, you know, really great wheelchairs, whatever that consists of. But the end users were like, oh, well, it's great, but it doesn't fit in the car boot. So if you haven't thought about that practical use, if you haven't asked the group who are going to use your research what they need, are you producing the right thing? So that's, as Natalia said, that's a lot about involving stakeholders, building relationships, building trust with community groups, with whoever you need to work with, and involving people in the design. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about moving the research over that wall into society, you know, how are you going to get your research into the hands of those people who implement the change, who make the change? And how have you ensured they can use it? You know, what language have you used? Have you checked that the language you use and the terms you use mean the same to that group and they use them in the same way? Where do they have their conversations? Where do they find information that they think is valuable? So, you know, in academia and research, journal papers are the way we decide the value or the reliability of something. But is that how your group finds it? So how can you support that when you're thinking about the impact of your research? Could you go to the next slide, please? And so this brings me to thinking about, you know, as a researcher, what do you need to know? What do you need to ensure that change happens, or to maximize the possibility of that change happening? You know, there's a lot of different skills involved in ensuring impact. And in the REF, I know that a study showed that they found 700, in the 2014 REF, they found 700 different pathways to impact. So, you know, that's a lot for a researcher to do, especially around all of their other tasks. You know, it's not like we have loads of spare time. You know, it's not like we have loads of resources. And, you know, so what can you do as a researcher to maximize that chance of impact happening, and to be able to talk about it, to be able to report it? So given the breadth of those possibilities, what we need to know is, what researchers need to have is impact literacy. And impact literacy, this is a term that's taken from the work of Julie Bailey at Lincoln and David Phipps at the University of Toronto to impact professionals. And impact literacy is basically, as a researcher, understanding what changes, for who, how you're going to demonstrate it. Apologies. How that research can be mobilized into action. So how you're going to get it over the wall, how can it be used? How do you put it into formats that people can use? Who who is involved in this across every stage of your research project, and ensuring the impact, subsequent impact. Who's involved in this, why, and with what skills, and why are you pursuing impact, and with what ethical considerations? And I think it's always worth remembering that it's possible to have a negative impact with research. It's possible to have a negative impact on a group. So thinking about the ethics about why you're doing what you're doing is also very important. If you could go to the next slide, please. And there are various myths around impact. One of them is that you can't plan for it. Planning for impact is something that you can do at any stage of your research project. And another question was, how do you know that impact has occurred? I think part of that comes in this planning. What are you going to decide the indicators of impact might be? How might you track that? So if we're thinking about something like, let's take something quite difficult. So let's take a theatre research, a play. How are you going to show that that's had an impact? How are you going to decide what change? How are you going to work out what change is? And part of that is understanding that impact can also be a change in behavior or a change in perception. And how might you kind of get that from your audience of that play? So might you, develop a survey? Might you, capture some of that tacit knowledge? Might you kind of get some testimonials from the audience members? That kind of demonstrable evidence. If you plan that beforehand, you can. It's much easier to write that kind of impact narrative, that impact story afterwards. So, how do you plan for impact? How do you kind of consider who needs to be involved? And there's basically this is a simple outline because we don't have lots of time, but what changes and for who? How will you know that that has changed? How can you most appropriately prove that? How can you create that kind of evidence? How will you record it? Where will you store it? Who will have access to it? How will you communicate it afterwards? So plans always change, new opportunities change, and obviously, research projects don't really happen in the linear way that they're planned to happen. But in planning for impact, in considering audiences, what people need, what resources, it's a map by which impact can be navigated. And I think a key thing about planning for impact is that accountability side. When you make a plan, you need to put things down in concrete terms. So, what activities might you undertake? Who will undertake them? How will you undertake them? And the budget, where will that come from? And who'll be accountable for tracking things? So I think planning is a really key skill that researchers can take away to make sure that their dominoes of impact fall in the best way. And that's part of what we're doing, our work at Emerald, developing kind of toolkits and tools around planning, etc. So if you do want to get in contact with me at any point, here's my email address, and Sharon's on this slide, which we'll share afterwards. Thank you very much. And I've added these on at the end for anyone who finds them useful.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Helen. Sorry about the delay. We get this slight pause as we crank up the video and the audio.
No problem.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, from my point of view, something that I was fascinated by your example of theatre, impact in theatre. I mean, I think the reason I'm interested in that is my sort of involvement in creativity and, research on creativity, and then, of course, considering, well, what does impact mean? And I thought what you were saying is absolutely right, because it's about pre-planning in an authentic way, isn't it, to build impact from the start. I mean, and in a way, it does take me back a little bit to the idea of close to practice. The key idea being that if you collaborate from the inception of a research project,
Yeah.
then impact's more likely, particularly if you're collaborating with organizations and individuals and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think also another thing that I forgot to mention, but that impact, attention doesn't equal impact. Dissemination doesn't necessarily equal impact. You can't, it's all about maximizing the chance of it happening rather than being able to control it.
Yeah. And I think also, as well as the more mechanistic parts of impact and measuring impact, if you take the example of the arts, of course, artists will say, well, one of the impacts I want is for people to have an experience they couldn't possibly have if they didn't attend or be part of. This, of course, is raising vital questions at the moment when artists are struggling in the pandemic. They seem to be the last group to be supported by government. I'm still in contact with professional musicians, and it's appalling, actually. So there's some going on there, and this is only anecdotal, but of course, another thing, this is powerful stories from individuals. Then we're into the qualitative tradition, aren't we?
Yeah, and impact in art has been around a long time. Like, Vasily Kandinsky, he wanted to, in his paintings, he specifically said he wanted them to resonate with people's souls. That's a specific statement of impact if you think about it like that.
How are we going to measure that one?
Yeah, I don't know, but
right. Anyway, we must keep moving, I think, because this is all building a very interesting set of ideas, and we've got lots. We can have more questions in the panel discussion towards the end. So thanks again, Helen. I'm going to call on Tom now for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's great to, just as it's starting to slide, let me take control. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Obviously, it's perhaps slightly easier for me to go third. I can kind of pick up some interesting themes that have been covered in colleagues' talks as we go through, and particularly kind of picking up the idea of the nature of impact. Clearly, education is a hugely kind of contentious and politically active area. We've seen that quite of late with COVID. The nature of experts and expertise, and also I think that point around planning and realizing kind of impact and engagement, especially in the context of REF in the UK, that's obviously a huge lever for UK academics. I suppose, as you can see, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the work I've been doing in Wales over the last 10 years. You can listen to me talking about this for a lot longer, for about 50 minutes with Nick, BERA director, as part of the BERA podcast. But I suppose I'm not going to focus too much on the specifics of the work. I probably wanted to just give you an idea of some of the big picture messages around kind of doing sort of public engagement and policy and impact, and particularly some of the challenges of policy change over a period, particularly education policy, and then I suppose kind of framed through some of the work in Wales that's kind of taken place over the last 10 years. And obviously we've been through major curriculum reform. There's sort of complexity of the nature of the four education systems of the UK, significant focus on what happens in England, probably to the detriment of awareness and visibility of what's happening across the other three devolved kind of educational systems. And again, in Wales, we've been going through major system level reform over the recent periods, and not just a new curriculum that was published in January 2020, obviously qualifications, initial teacher education, paying conditions, accountability from the inspectorate. So essentially everything is up in the air. So this is a huge opportunity, and huge kind of challenges sort of manifest through major system level reform. And also we have the political context of the May elections for Senedd Cymru for the Welsh Parliament. So we will have a new kind of look Welsh government from May 2021, and we will definitely have a new Minister for Education. So lots has happened over the past kind of 5 years, ignoring COVID, but actually we will have a lot more as we start to look at curriculum enactment and qualifications reform and the wider implementation of the system level reforms in Wales. And again, you can see that kind of timeline. This is from 2017 to kind of looking forward sort of 10 years, but some of my work goes back to 2011. And again, I think that theme around longevity and recognizing the kind of pragmatism of doing some of this work can be quite challenging. I suppose very, very briefly, my work is focused around digital, cross-curricular digital competencies. So I chaired the ICT review back in 2013 and the development of a digital competence framework. And I've just recently chaired the development of the science and technology area of learning experience. So one of the biggest of the 6 new areas of learning experience in the curriculum for Wales. And this will start to roll in from September 2022. And again, I think there's a number of those themes, both specifically kind of education focused, but also wider kind of economic and kind of public policy focused, and around that wider international attention and scrutiny on education change and reform. And again, it's that underpinning evidence-based, the research-based, to kind of allow this to happen and to provide the context and the rigor and robustness, but also recognizing the kind of practicalities and the wider political and policy context around how long things take to actually happen. I chaired the ICT review back in 2013, and we will essentially start to see, we saw some changes in 2016, but we will start to see major changes from September 2022. So it's a very long period of time to make that happen. And particularly that kind of interdisciplinarity focus around, we know things like STEM education has a massive economic imperative and there's been huge investment. Sometimes you can see the skewing effect that can have, and how do you reconcile that in the context of a broad and balanced new curriculum that was developed in Wales for Wales, particularly acknowledging the wider cultural artifacts like Welsh language and history, but then also recognizing the kind of the economic imperatives of why a new curriculum was needed. And again, the underpinning evidence and how that was driven around, bemoaning the fact that sometimes it can be policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy or evidence-based policy making. And especially in the context of, heavily politicized around expertise, having had enough of experts, and the evidence base can be highly misleading description about how this stuff can be used in policy. But I suppose this has been a significant period of time where we've seen international attention on what's happening in Wales. But I probably wanted to capture some of the thoughts around having worked on this for a long time, along with colleagues at Swansea and across other parts of Wales, but actually trying to kind of capture some of my thoughts and recommendations for why it's sometimes quite hard to do policy, and also the kind of frustrations that academics can have about doing policy. And this isn't just on a policy impact in the context of REF and impact case studies, but actually, I suppose, trying to use your research and use your wider academic activities to enact positive change. And I acknowledge the kind of criticality question that Natalia had right at the start. And I think we can unpick some of that as we go to the panel. But I suppose some of the themes I wanted to pick up, and essentially, basically, don't be an academic that can't explain your research in less than 200 pages in 2 years after it starts, and only use words of 3 syllables or more. There's that policy translation aspect about, you need to be able to speak to non-academics. You need to be able to translate your research and make it tractable and understandable. Don't hide it all away. It's interesting around the challenges of academic dissemination of publishing and paywalls, but your work needs to be accessible and readable. You can't just point a policymaker or a senior civil servant to your 40-page journal paper. It has to be understandable. So that point around blogging, social media, the visibility, the kind of interactions that can facilitate useful types of engagement and policy making, the accessibility is really, really key. I also say, don't say everything about this policy area is crap and I hate it all. That's kind of a pointless lament. It can be quite cathartic at times, but actually that's useless to officials because they can't agree with you. So I think that kind of pragmatism about saying, it can make you feel better, but actually don't be surprised if that doesn't get acted upon. So don't say all of this stuff is rubbish, you need to change it all. That isn't very useful in a policy context, and that is very difficult to develop those trusted relationships to try and start to think about policy change and impact. Don't say, I can't believe politicians act politically. Yes, they do. If you want to be heard, explain why this fits in and with what they're trying to do. You need to have some kind of fluency and adaptability in some contexts. It's kind of, it links back to that criticality, but you have to be kind of cognizant of the government and the politics of the day, and recognize that there is a policy narrative that some of the work will have to fit into, and it is about adapting and kind of reconciling that at stages. You also clearly need to understand about how the mechanism of the mechanics of government works. So you can't be naive to what you're proposing requires a major change in legislation. So obviously a new curriculum for Wales requires primary legislation that has to wend its way through the Senedd. So we need a new Education Act before the new curriculum can start from September 2022. And then it's not your job necessarily to think about the kind of the financeability or the kind of costs of this, but you have to recognise that will factor into some of the kind of policy making aspects of this too. And again, I think, the classic mistake, this is sort of the deficit kind of model type. We saw this with Brexit in the sense of, belief revision with new information, actually just bombarding people doesn't convince them that with information doesn't convince them that is the right thing to do. And actually that kind of the tractability and the kind of the messaging is really, really important for people to better understand why change is needed, why it's important and how it can be acted upon. And again, I think that comes back to kind of those trusted relationships and networks where there's a period of time in which you've established and developed those wider kind of public engagement, policy connections, media, the visibility and transferability, the kind of transparency of what you're doing and how that's linked to underpinning evidence and research to better explain why these things need to be changed and actually how they could be changed. And I think that you have to kind of think about your audience. Sometimes it can become quite mechanistic with the context of REF and thinking about impact case studies. And I suppose I think you can plan for impact. You can be quite aspirational about the impact your work can have, and you can start to build the foundation for how that can start to affect major policy change like curriculum reform and qualifications reform on a national scale. But you have to recognize that some of these things will take a long time. You will have to get outside your comfort zone. You will have to recognize that it isn't just about publishing high quality journal papers. There's wider responsibilities and activities that can have a massive benefit impact. And speaking to a range of different stakeholders, from on the ground practitioners to the various layers of government, professional bodies, learning societies. Like BERA is a good example for this. But again, that it can take a long time, and you do have to recognize that from review or kind of challenge to actually policy reform and change can take a long time. It can take multiple governments. So this has been 3 ministers worth of work for some of the curriculum reform stuff that I've been involved in. So I suppose it's been very, very enjoyable. It has been kind of stressful at times, but I think hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into some of the kind of challenges and opportunities with doing this kind of work. And I suppose the benefits, because it actually adds adds real context to the wider academic work that we're all involved in. So thank you very much, Dr. Valerian, and I'll hand back to Dominic and colleagues.
Tom, excellent, thank you. I think one of the things that struck me about what you were saying, so many things, but one in particular, I suppose, was this whole question of evidence and policy making. Like you, I've had various involvements, particularly around curriculum, actually in, actually now all the nations in Great Britain, not just the UK, and other countries around the world. But it does make me reflect constantly on how things become influential. I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of the advice you were giving is spot on. And I would normally be the one like you saying, well, policy influence takes a long time. And yet, sometimes it's the right kind of study at the right kind of time, it is almost instant. There've been a couple of examples of this in England recently of, for example, the proposals around what we do in terms of A-level students and equivalent moving to university. Do we need predictions, or can we work? That was something that a piece of research was. Yeah.
And I think that's really key around that. I suppose it links to the kind of the adaptability and flexibility piece, because when the curriculum change in England between 2013 and 2014, in the run up to that, particularly the kind of around computer science, I was perfectly involved in some of the work in England. Obviously, when Gove disapplied the ICT programs of study, and there was a lot of focus around curriculum reform, things happened very, very quickly. So I think you wanted to link back to the evidence base, but you also need to take advantage of that policy kind of tractability, and you knew change was going to happen, you knew it was going to happen quickly, and actually how can you ensure that you can facilitate that happening? So, you know, yes, things can take a long time, particularly in the nature of curriculum qualifications, but actually sometimes they can change horrifically quickly, and that can be difficult in itself. But I think you have to be ready for that sort of serendipitous moment and that opportunity, and to help as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on that with another point, but I just to say to everyone listening in, now's your chance to start penning some questions for us. We're going to have a panel discussion, and we will try and answer any questions that come in. So, as I say, please do grab your chance while you can with these experts to ask the questions, you know, about any of the issues really, or propose ideas. We're also very happy with that. Yeah, Tom, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of Wales, you know, BERA is genuinely committed to the Four Nations of the UK. That's why we're the British Educational Research Association, although of course that's kind of, when you get down to the definitions, that's quite a misnomer, isn't it? But anyway, and I was fortunate to do a bit of advice on some aspects of the curriculum, the creativity bit, the language and arts bit, not the Welsh language. I hasten to add, I would be not the right person for that. But then I want to sort of, so I was so impressed actually by the way that thinking was going, the more long term, you know, you mentioned long term, and I do think in terms of curriculum change that there are strong arguments to say we need to learn to do things in a more measured way, not throw the baby out with the bathwater every change of government and so on. But then you mentioned Michael Gove's changes in England, and of course we're fortunate in that Mary James, past president of BERA, was one of the 4 or 5 advisors to the curriculum changes, and she documented and has posted on the BERA website all of the communications, because unfortunately it didn't go too well in terms of, because those experts, apart from one of them, I think, refused to be associated with the changes in the end and resigned from their positions. So now all of that is rather important, isn't it? Because those people were eminent and expert in curriculum, and nobody takes the decision lightly to be, once you're in the room, nobody takes the decision lightly to walk out of the room. But that is what happened, and I think it's important also that Mary, I think she did a blog post some years ago on this, but as I say, these materials are available. I just think it's so important we keep a record as well, you know.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it's interesting capturing the kind of process. You know, obviously a lot of work has been done around, you know, colleagues like Mark Priestley at Stirling, you know, from a kind of curriculum enactment perspective. And obviously we've seen major changes across essentially all 4 nations of the UK over recent years. How do we capture some of that thinking? Because there is massive international attention, you know, from the OECD and other organisations around what does a modern curriculum entail and what does it aim to achieve. And I think Wales has an interesting kind of cultural context. It has an interesting socioeconomic context. Obviously, the kind of devolution of education from 1999 onwards, where the prevailing kind of sort of national curriculum was very similar to England. Yeah. I think this is the first time where you've had that kind of co-construction with practitioners. You've had meaningful thinking around what does a curriculum for Wales to create future citizens of Wales look like. And again, I think documenting that process, you know, particularly the kind of key actors involved in that process, even from a kind of an ethnographic perspective, but just to understand some of the kind of the levers and the drivers and the wider policy context is really, really important, because clearly the economic imperatives are also very important around people having the kind of future skills, for want of a better phrase. And that can sometimes really skew kind of the window in which you evaluate the success of a curriculum or otherwise.
Yeah. Thanks so much for mentioning Mark. Mark was on a panel on an event that BERA organised on curriculum, and it went really well. And then I've recently invited Mark to do a seminar at UCL, and it was really interesting to hear from him again. And I think actually one interesting thing that's going on at the moment is Ireland. And Ireland are developing their primary curriculum. And I'm one of 4 academic advisors to that work based on, it came out of some previous work I'd done for them, a piece of research. But really interesting, the slow pace they're taking, the way evidence has been embedded in complex and multitude ways from the beginning. Yeah. It's really different, I think, even compared to what Scotland done, what Wales have done. I'm not, England has done some really interesting stuff as well. They've just done it differently, and all these things are a mixture of good and bad, aren't they? If you want to put it like that. So yeah, we've got questions coming in, but if you want to have a quick comeback.
Yeah, just very quickly, I remember when the curriculum for Wales was first published, or rather Graham Donaldson's review was published in February 2015. I remember in February 2016, BBC Wales did a 1 year on from the new curriculum, and actually obviously nothing would have happened. I think the kind of that reflection of, or the recognition that this will take a long time, and in political and policy terms, that will probably transcend 2 governments. So that's very, very difficult because there's so much public and media scrutiny around the success or otherwise of the curriculum.
I agree. And you mentioned, of course, that OECD and Pearls and Tims and so on are both, I think, rich resources and genuinely useful, but also quite worryingly interpreted sometimes by policymakers who say, oh, look, my initiatives work because we've gone up the league table. So, right, better get some questions. I'm going to ask if we can release the panel back into the room. If Maria Beer can do the technology. Excellent. Here they come. And we've got a few questions lining up here. So I'm going to begin with a question. It's the most popular question at the moment. I'm not always going to be dominated by popularism, I'll tell you. But this is Sharon Smith, and she says, what advice might you give to those conducting research outside of the university context? Practitioners in mainstream school and AP settings have fantastic insights to share, but without an academic setting making their voices heard can be a challenge. Anyone want to go first on? Well, go on, Tom, you're nodding, so that's enough.
The reason why I think that's a really interesting question. The reason why I was kind of nodding is because there's been a massive push, like from some of the work you've been doing in Wales around, a new national strategy for educational research and inquiry, and BEER have been involved in promoting the kind of the educational research base in Wales. I think part of that is around close to practice research and embedding a research culture within practitioners. So as part of the wider reforms around initial teacher education, that is a focus to make research much more accessible to practitioners, much more tractable to a variety of different contexts. And I think, as part of that, there are wider strategies around, there's a national masters in education that's being implemented from September. But I think it is still a really real challenge because there is still kind of there's authority and hierarchy around who is doing research and how well it is received. And I think maybe academics can be better in that to engage with some of our kind of practitioner colleagues to have those more open relationships to kind of showcase the different types of research that go on, and particularly recognizing the kind of evaluation type research to understand kind of how that impacts pedagogy and practice.
Yeah, I'm going to bring, I think I'd like both Natalia then Helen to comment on this question. Natalia, if I turn to you first, what does this sort of mean to you, the issue that's raised by Sharon?
I think Tom is absolutely right. That some of these hierarchies that we established are not working in our favor. We need to make sure that we involve practitioners from the beginning in a genuine way, that we do not empower them in some kind of false narrative, but that we recognize that they need the tools if we really see them as collaborators. And by tools, I mean the knowledge of how research works, how it can be documented, and how it can be impactful.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it's about building partnerships, isn't it? And I think partnerships between academics and practitioners, they're based on trust, and they're based on a two-way. You don't just take from the people you're working with, you give. And a lot of it is around I don't know, language, like using the same, checking you're using the same language, setting out the terms of your partnership or relationship at the beginning. And I think part of the problem for both academics and for practitioners is finding each other, you know, that kind of networking, that kind of matchmaking of people who are researching with practitioners who are trying to implement. And I don't have the perfect answer for that, but I just say, you know, it's something that people are trying to change. So, you know, perhaps attending now everything's online, you can attend different kind of events as a practical step. As Natalia said, it's about the skills as well. So, you know, understanding how research is peer reviewed, understanding what makes kind of quality research, what makes quality evidence in an academic sense. And I think also there's small things as well around, you know, what Tom was saying about policy making. There are ways for practitioners to also give evidence. You know, there's frequently calls for evidence for different committees, and you can sign up to notifications for those, and that's a place to get your kind of voice and insights heard. There are other different kind of avenues where you can be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. I mean, it's all, in the first instance, it's about saying to yourself, whether you're a teacher or some other kind of practitioner. I mean, we can talk about actors, musicians, if we wish, but first of all, it's about saying, I care about evidence, I care about research. And I think the questions that you're all raising in different ways about, then there are questions of quality, actually. What kind of research should we attend to? What is high quality? And one thing I'm going to say is the biggest risk is thinking that one research study, no matter how large scale, no matter how eminent the principal investigator is, one research study does not prove anything conclusively. Very rare. And I mean, if I had to give an example, I would give a very robust example of randomized controlled trials that proved there was a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. 50 years ago, those first trials were done, and the smoking wasn't banned in public places until very recently. Why? Because more than one study was needed, of course, but also because the politics got in the way, and so on. So some of our deepest held issues, like how do we help learners from poverty background, you know, in poverty, succeed? Some of these profound questions are very complex, aren't they? And people have to have a bit of patience as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm blathering on. Let's go to another question now. I am going to go in, this one's been voted, it's got 7 votes, so I'm going to go for this one. It's another Sharon P. Helen mentioned that impact can be very small. It doesn't need to be as big as policy change, etc. Do the panel have any examples of smaller impacts? Yeah, who would like to go for, well, perhaps not Tom first on this one. Would either Natalia or Helen like to have a first stab at this?
It's difficult to know in this digital room who wants to.
Yeah, who's first? you go first, Natalia.
Okay. I think the importance of humbleness in all this discussion is really, really not to be underestimated. You know, I can give an example from my work. To me, it is, but actually I don't see it as a small impact. You know, if a child says that this is their favorite book now, and the book is based on good research evidence, and we have a study documenting that the child made a progress and so on and so forth. If the child likes the book and they have it as their favorite book for bedtime reading, to me, that's perhaps a very small example of impact to stakeholders that I work with, but to me personally, it's a big impact. So it really depends on your research context, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Helen, do you want to have a...
Yeah, I'm struggling to remember the actual policy change that was made in this example. So bear with me, I might even have to I can't remember it, but basically in a small scale study, somebody made a change in their local authority healthcare in a really local way, but it was effective with that group. And then it was able to be, the practice of it was able to be scaled up and taken on board at a larger level, and then again at a larger level. So kind of tracking that, I'll remember in about 10 minutes and I'll write in the chat what the actual policy change was. But
sneaky Google it. Well,
yeah.
Actually, my example is probably similar to Helen's in that sense. I suppose, when you do think about kind of big bang policy changes or things like curriculum reform, I think it's a combination of bottom up and top down. And I suppose, particularly some of the kind of co-construction stuff that happened as part of the curriculum in Wales, but in particular when we were developing or trying to raise the prominence of things like cross-curricular digital competence, that required you to evangelize or to try and convert practitioners who were previously quite reluctant or resistant to the utility of kind of effective digital practice. So this meant changing practice in specific schools for specific teachers, and once that you start to see that having an impact on their context and their setting for their learners, then you were going to start to see the kind of big picture of reform stuff that you were trying to do was going to be more successful. And I think that it requires both of those. You needed that engagement, you needed that you see the realization that it would be beneficial for their practice. And again, I think it was the criticality. It wasn't just sort of saying, digital is the panacea for everything. It was the kind of it is about evidence. It is about evaluation. It is about understanding what it means for your learners and for your specific context. And I think that gave the confidence for trying to push for major curriculum, kind of major change, because you could evidence best practice and exemplars across a variety of contexts.
Yeah, I think for me, let's take a teacher. They could be early years, primary, secondary, college, university, and a teacher has a question, and it's a question they think, I need to know more to answer this question. I'm actually thinking of the work of Tim Kane, who was at Edge Hill University for many years, and he's published quite a number of articles related to small-scale teacher inquiry. And sometimes it's not even that the teachers gather new empirical data. First of all, they identify a type question, a research question, and then they get supported by an academic, for example, or other researcher, to identify work that's already been published. And the point here is more about the small scale. It's one teacher first. It might become a department. It might be a whole school, still small scale. And in the end, what matters is, does it help them in their professional practice? Do they teach better? Do children learn more because of it, or pupils or students? So I think there's a lot of, and there's a history. I mean, if you go back in time, there were those good practice awards that the Department for Education used to run. I used to assess on those, and there were a lot of them and a lot of teachers engaged. And now there are these research networks like the EEF. Of course, the EEF, some of the EEF's work is huge, large scale, large funding, but some of it is much more modest and is helping ground up stuff, isn't it? Right, brilliant. We've got lots of questions now, so I will crack on. Andrew Clapham, I was interested in your comment on the sphere of influence slide. You said, I thought about what impact I wanted. My question is, at what point during your research did you ask this?
I guess that's a question to me.
Mm-hmm.
I asked it right at the beginning. I think this goes back to what was said also in the introduction, that to plan in advance is really important for this type of work. So I asked this question right at the very start as you are designing your study.
Thanks, Natalia. I'm going to move on to Valeria Scacchi. Can we also talk about more qualitative ways of measuring and understanding impact? We don't all work in the positivist sphere. I've got a lot of views about this, but I'm going to keep quiet. Let someone else come in first. Oh. Shall I?
think-
shall I-
Go for it. Frame
All right.
frame it for us. That'd be useful.
Well, first of all, my sense of this is, high quality, in-depth, qualitative work is part of the overall research landscape. It serves a very important purpose. We know that if you want to do, for example, mixed methods designs where you mix perhaps a randomized controlled trial with an in-depth process evaluation, both sides are essential. One is useless without the other, really. So in one way, Valeria, I get where you're coming from. Now, where I might beg to differ a little bit is this idea that we don't all work in the positivist sphere. Well, this is philosophy. I mean, and these philosophical arguments, epistemological arguments have gone on for hundreds of years. And I do think labeling, I'm an interpretivist, I'm a positivist, I think there are real risks in that. Anyway, that's just, it's a bugbear of mine. Does anyone else want to say anything on that particular question?
I guess, oh, sorry, you go, Tom.
No, go for it.
Helen, then Tom.
I was just going to say, in terms of evidence, evidence can be quantitative and evidence can be qualitative. It's still evidence. So, qualitative evidence of impact is in the form of different things, but say testimonials, interviews, and capturing tacit knowledge is always a question. How are you going to capture that knowledge that people have in their heads? And there are different ways of doing that. There are many different ways of doing that for many different types of research, but evidence isn't, when you're providing evidence, you need to think of it in a kind of a dashboard approach. It's not one number or one thing. It's this kind of putting stuff together in a narrative. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, no, I would echo those comments. I think it's kind of interesting in the sense of this kind of philosophical, kind of ideological foundations, particularly for social science research and research methods. I kind of, I would probably slightly reflect on the comments around some policymakers would probably be horrified if you start throwing those terms out. I would say that in a very pragmatic way, because that means nothing for what they're trying to achieve. But I think you can provide that robustness to sort of say it is about that narrative. It is about, the kind of the triangulation or the application of both quant and qual approaches to better understand the problem that we're trying to look at. I think it can be quite challenging sometimes if you come with very kind of methodological approaches to specific policymaking contexts. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to be, how are you going to translate that and kind of and articulate that to the kind of key stakeholders? But I think it is about, if it turns into an ideological argument between kind of quant and qual, then I think you will probably you'll fall down at the first hurdle, especially if you're engaging with politicians or policymakers. And I think that is kind of beholden on us as social scientists, researchers, to better navigate that kind of ideological philosophical landscape to translate to some of the work.
Yeah, and just to do a quick plug for a BERA publication, if I may, the BERA Handbook of Educational Research, which is, I'm afraid, mainly a library copy because it's a huge 2-volume thing. But in the editor's introduction, incidentally, given we're talking about, to some degree, about digital technologies, Neil Selwyn is one of the editors. We make the point as editors that this is a dead debate. I'm sorry, I don't mean that disrespectfully, but what I mean is the adversarial qual quant.
Yeah.
We're beyond that. We're so beyond that. And the second point I'd like to say is, I heard what you said earlier, Tom, about policymakers and the need for researchers to understand the language policymakers use. Even more than that, understand the conditions under which they work, the relationship with the media, and so on. But of course, there's research on that as well, isn't there? And interested people can understand those conditions. It's not that one has to surrender one's philosophies, or especially if they're underpinned by sound empirical work. Earlier, I don't know if you were trying to get in there, or
I was reflecting. I was thinking, yeah.
In the smallest way, I might.
No, I was just thinking that perhaps one of the reasons why we get seduced into this dichotomy could be, particularly in relation to technologies, is that we are so surrounded by these technologies that offer us these quantitative metrics all the time, you know, number of likes and number of downloads. But as social scientists, I need to remind myself all the time how important words are, and the authenticity of specific comments we get from the people we work with. You know, that is what demonstrates the quality of the dialogue and conversation we have with them.
I just completely echo that, particularly because I probably, from a slightly less traditional kind of education research background, I would completely echo that, because I would probably have had a much more quantitative view of the world. But actually, the recent work, particularly over the past kind of 5+ years, has really emphasized where the kind of the qualitative view, particularly around terminology and context and setting and power and position and, you know, and kind of networks and relationships. I think that, you know, that none of this would have been possible if you weren't able to take from both of those domains. And I suppose all that encourages in me is to say the interdisciplinarity of some of this work is also really, really important. So, you know, I would echo Natalia's comments completely.
I think also, oh, sorry.
Go on, Helen,
I was going to say, I think also it's worth bearing in mind, if you're talking about policy, that policymakers, when they're building policy, they take from both sources, quantitative and qualitative. You know, in their calls for evidence, those are written quantitative statements, but they also use, you know, metrics and qualitative. And the other thing I'd say is that in terms of policy, you know, the government has the knowledge exchange unit, and they run tons of kind of events at trying to kind of build that bridge between researchers and policy, and help researchers with engaging with policymakers. Those are always worth attending.
And I just want to, you know, what we are not saying here, of course, is that qualitative research needs a special pleading. It doesn't. It's part of, I mean, I remember going to Ingrid Schoon's keynote at IOE, and to sum up, she said, if you want to improve disadvantaged children's life chances, put money in their pockets. Now, it was a kind of throwaway, deliberate in a way, because the whole talk had been built on the massive data sets of the birth cohort studies. And these are massive, longitudinal, hugely expensive, some of the most expensive research in social science, quantitative, wholly quantitative and sophisticated quantification at that. And they are providing us with some answers that no other form of research can provide. So, you know, I've been absolutely committed to quants ever since I started researching, but I also see very much the value of qualitative and the ways you can mix. And I think there are this is the point, there are fascinating questions about what happens when you mix different kinds of methods, when different disciplines come together. You know, that's where the frontiers lie for me. Right, we've now got 8 minutes left. So my fellow BERA Council member, Tanya Ovenden Hope, has got a question. Research and knowledge exchange are separated through REF and KEF. Knowledge exchange framework, just in case people are not familiar with this. For impact, this separation feels unhelpful. Is planning for impact in research the way to ensure the two are more explicitly linked?
So
Helen was in.
Go for it. No, go for it.
I'd say that KEF, I mean, whether it does or doesn't in practice, KEF doesn't aim to separate knowledge exchange and impact research. And the way it's been designed is very, very different. So REF is all about, you know, the case studies of impact, and knowledge exchange isn't really for the researchers, it's for the institutions. And so the institutions put together a narrative and put together and decide their own metrics based on which knowledge cluster they fit into. So even though they seem separate, they're not meant to be. Whether that works out in practice or not is another question. I think knowledge exchange framework is about kind of developing those practices. I mean, again, the researchers don't implement impact. It's the practitioners and it happens outside, but the researchers do implement knowledge exchange. So the behaviours around knowledge exchange that are part of the KEF should in practice facilitate the impact that you have in REF. But again, REF and KEF are just measures, and we have to go along with them, but they're not necessarily why anyone gets into research. But that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that exactly. I mean, I think it's interesting around the kind of skewing effect that these kind of frameworks have had on academia, kind of ever since I've been, from PhD onwards. I think there's, I think it's interesting around where, say, like the Higher Education kind of Statistics Agency are looking at those kind of the data sets and metrics that would underpin things like KEF and how that would support institutions in their activities. I think you can be quite cynical and maybe a bit more kind of pragmatic about, how are these policy levers on us as academics? Can they be used and manipulated to do the things we want to do? I would probably lament that TEF doesn't feature very highly in some of these. It's kind of ironic that there still feels a massive disconnect between high quality learning and teaching in the context of thinking about research and knowledge exchange. They are quite disjoint and disparate, which seems to be quite strange when you look at the functions of academics and researchers and our roles and activities. I suppose at some level you have to kind of play the game, but at least it recognizes that kind of doing things like policy or doing things like public engagement and all those wider activities outside of publishing 4-star papers and bringing in money, that these are beneficial and impactful and they are measured in some way, and not just quantitatively, they are qualitatively measured as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think at this point I want to remind everyone of the fact that universities have been praised recently by government in England for the work they've done during the pandemic, and that list you just gave, Tom, I'm too familiar with it. Of course, I've worked in 3 universities in my career, and we're juggling so many things. I mean, lots of people are, of course, but I do feel particularly for the conditions of, say, new lecturers and the pressure. Of course, as we know, these metrics may well be valuable in some respects, but they create pressures, huge pressures sometimes in the system. And so, this is really me just reminding, as if we need reminding, how important our colleagues are, actually. Right, okay, going well, 4 minutes. Omar Favwe Egowara, who kindly says to us, my name in brief is Omar, thanks. Helen, you've mentioned a few times that there are many ways to capture tacit knowledge. Can you name some, please? Oh,
sorry, I'm in a presentation.
Do they want to join?
Yeah. Sorry, someone in my household has picked now to do the hoovering.
Classic.
Yeah. Sorry. So ways to capture tacit knowledge. I can name a few. It depends on the research that you're doing and the type of knowledge that you're trying to capture. But essentially, if you're capturing the tacit knowledge that's around processes in people's heads, that's kind of about, say, mapping that out. If you're trying to capture, you can also do that in the form of testimonials and interviews, and you can record that. I don't know if you have an example of research that I could use to kind of think of ways to capture that tacit knowledge, but it's because it's very specific to the task you're doing. That, yeah, I mean even that there are ways to record, like with permission, you can record a conversation that 2 professionals are having that shows that tacit knowledge in practice. It's about thinking a bit outside the box, but there are, hopefully that helps.
Talking outside the box, perhaps we make this the last question today, and I think this is really interesting, and if I can ask you to give reasonably short answers and maybe spin off a few ideas. So Anna Plale says, when considering impact, I'm interested in how academics can generate a more creative, reciprocal approach to dissemination. Do you have any suggestions for creative methods of dissemination beyond blogs and podcasts, to continue the dialogue with practitioners and a wider public audience. And I will do a quick big up for BERA office colleagues, including Marie and Dior on today, for the work they've done in transforming BERA from a mainly in-person organisation to new digital opportunities. But we are still genuinely interested in what more can we do. So Natalia, I'm going to come to you first on this one, if that's okay. Spin off a few ideas that we might use to engage more, even more.
I love the question because it really is not about going on Twitter and writing a blog. It could well be a performance. Maybe you want to dance your research with someone. Maybe you want to engage in some collaborative arts making that is representing your work in an artifact. That will be my one quick suggestion.
Yeah, Helen.
I mean, you could offer it. You can do things like offer workshops and skills within the community. So you can have that kind of backwards and forwards. I mean, there's even things like a research project where they wanted to raise awareness around the history of women in engineering. They had like storytelling sessions where they got people to come and write fiction. And they also had these Wikipedia sessions where they taught everybody how to edit in Wikipedia and then got everyone to update Wikipedia entries, which is, you're sharing a skill, but you're also, so it's, that kind of thing.
Brilliant. Tom?
The Wikipedia example is fantastic, especially for kind of for female scientists. I think that's the kind of prominence and visibility is a really big thing there. I suppose further to all the excellent ideas, catastrophic going last, but I think there's that wider piece around civic mission. I think that's really important as a lever on universities. I think you could ask some valid questions around kind of resources to allow us to do it effectively. But say particularly for Swansea, we want to be an internationally recognised university with kind of global reach, but we care about where we are in Swansea and we care about supporting the locality and the region. So actually, what does that mean around socioeconomically, kind of post-industrial communities in the Swansea valleys? How do we get reach with these people, with these kind of communities? And it's more meaningful and sustained. It's not just about going to give a talk at a community centre. How do we make the university not just that thing that's near the hospital in Swansea or the new campus? It's actually like, what does the kind of meaningful relationship look like? So I think it requires resource and time and effort to do that. And I think we're starting to see, hopefully in a post-COVID times, that we will have we will still have the time and space to do this effectively, and it will be taken seriously.
Yeah.
Brilliant. All that remains for me then is to thank Natalia, Helen, and Tom immensely for your presentations and your contribution, to thank Emerald for the partnership and the work that was done to generate this event, to thank Marie and colleagues at BERA for all the support they've given. For the audience, just to say thank you. What a excellent range of questions, profound issues we've entered into here. And also just to say that BERA, as part of its diversifying what it does, it's making these recordings available online. So the curriculum event that briefly Tom and I touched on, which was Mark Priestley, there was my BERA colleagues, Vari and Jerry, there was Chris Brown. That's already up there, available. If people in the audience haven't seen it, they can go to that. So I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much for being part of this. And goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.